The smell lingered in my clothes for weeks. April 29th, 1945. Dachau concentration camp, Bavaria, Germany. Rain had fallen that morning, turning the ground to mud that clung to our boots as we moved among the dead and dying. The stench was indescribable. Human waste, disease, rotting flesh, and something else I came to recognize as despair itself, a palpable miasma that hung in the air. I clutched my prayer book like a shield, my silver cross heavy around my neck. Words failed me that day. Not just human words, but even the divine words I had devoted my life to sharing. What scripture could possibly speak to such horror? What prayer could adequately address both the suffering of the innocent and the magnitude of evil that had created this place? I was Father Thomas Sullivan, 38 years old, chaplain with the 42nd Rainbow Division of the United States Army. Before the war, I had served as a parish priest in a small church outside Boston. I'd counseled grieving widows, baptized newborns, heard confessions of ordinary sins, adultery, dishonesty, envy. I had believed these experiences prepared me for military chaplaincy. Nothing could have prepared me for Dachau. We had heard rumors about the camps, intelligence reports, refugee testimonies, whispered accounts of systematic atrocities. But American soldiers, myself included, had dismissed some of these stories as propaganda exaggerations. Surely even war had limits. Surely human beings could not do such things to other human beings. Our education in humanity's capacity for evil began the moment our division approached the camp. The first thing we encountered was a train of some 40 open rail cars filled with bodies, over 2,000 dead, left to rot in the April sun. Prisoners who had been evacuated from other camps as Allied forces advanced, transported without food or water until they succumbed to starvation or exposure. Beyond the train stood the camp itself, barracks designed for 6,000 people but housing more than 30,000. Living skeletons in striped uniforms, too weak to celebrate their liberation, and the dead, piled in rooms, stacked like cordwood outside the crematorium, filling mass graves at the camp's edges. My duties were clear, if overwhelming. I administered last rites to the dying. I prayed over mass graves as bulldozers covered hundreds of emaciated bodies with earth. I listened to survivors tell of unimaginable cruelty, of medical experiments, of systematic dehumanization. I held their hands as they wept, these men reduced to bones and haunted eyes. "Father, where was God?" they asked me. I had no answer that didn't taste like ash in my mouth. The division chaplain assigned me to the camp's makeshift infirmary. The medical personnel were fighting a desperate battle against typhus, dysentery, and tuberculosis. Many prisoners were beyond saving, too far gone in starvation to benefit from the food now available, their bodies, paradoxically, destroyed by the very nourishment they had been denied. I moved between their cots, offering what spiritual comfort I could, recording final messages for families who were likely dead themselves. 3 days after liberation, as I was leaving the infirmary after a long shift, a young American lieutenant stopped me. "Father, there's an SS man who's asking for a priest," he said, his voice tight with controlled anger. "He's dying. Took some bullets during the liberation. The medic says he won't last the night." "Where is he?" I asked, my voice sounding distant to my own ears. "Prisoner hospital, far corner, separated from the inmates." The lieutenant's expression made his feelings clear. "Nobody would blame you for being too busy, Father." I hesitated. Since arriving at Dachau, I had seen several SS guards who had been wounded during the liberation. Some had been shot while attempting to flee. Others had been beaten by prisoners who turned on their former tormentors once American troops arrived. A few had been summarily executed by American soldiers, overwhelmed by rage at what they discovered in the camp. I had felt no call to minister to these men. My compassion, my prayers, my energy had been entirely focused on their victims. But now one was specifically asking for a priest, for last rites, for the sacrament that Catholic teaching holds is necessary for the soul's journey after death. My theological training was unequivocal. As a priest, I was obligated to offer the sacraments to any baptized Catholic who requested them, regardless of their sins. My humanity, however, rebelled at the very thought of offering spiritual comfort to someone who had participated in such methodical evil. "I'll see him," I said finally, the words like stones in my mouth. The guard was in an isolated corner of the infirmary, under watch by an American MP who looked relieved to be temporarily relieved of his duty. The German's uniform had been removed, replaced by a standard-issue U.S. Army hospital gown. Without the black SS uniform, he looked disconcertingly ordinary. A man in his 30s, pale from blood loss, his breathing labored. Bandages covered his chest where 2 bullets had entered. The wounds were clearly mortal. Blood seeped through the white gauze despite the medic's best efforts. He turned his head as I approached, his eyes registering my chaplain's insignia and the cross around my neck. "Danke," he whispered. "Bitte, ein Priester." "Thank you. Please." A priest. I stood at the foot of his cot, unable to move closer. "I'm Father Sullivan," I said in the German I had learned during my seminary years. "You asked for a priest?" "Last rites," he said, his voice barely audible. "Please." Something broke inside me then, a dam holding back the horror and rage I had suppressed beneath professional composure since arriving at Dachau. "Do you understand what you're asking?" My voice emerged harsher than I had ever spoken in clerical. "Capacity. Do you know what I've seen in this place? What you and your kind have done?" His eyes closed briefly, then opened again. "I know," he said. "I know what we did." "And still you think you deserve the comfort of the sacraments?" I was trembling now, my prayer book clutched so tightly my knuckles whitened. These people begged for mercy. Did you grant it to them? He didn't answer immediately. A rattling breath escaped him, and for a moment I thought he had died. Then, "No," he whispered. "But I was taught that God's mercy is greater than man's sin." The same theology I had preached countless times from my pulpit in Boston, the same promise of divine forgiveness that formed the cornerstone of my vocation. In any other context, I would have affirmed this immediately. Here, standing among the consequences of methodical genocide, those words seemed obscene. I turned away from him, stepping outside into the night air. Stars glittered overhead, impossibly beautiful above such suffering. I leaned against the rough wooden wall of the infirmary and tried to pray. No words came. Instead, memory flooded through me, the faces of the living dead we had found in the barracks, the testimonies of survivors describing casual brutality, the children's shoes piled in a storage room, the meticulous records kept of atrocities. How could God expect me to extend his forgiveness to someone who had participated in such evil? Yet refusing to administer last rites to a dying Catholic who had requested them constituted a profound violation of my priestly vows. It placed me in the position of judge, a role explicitly reserved for God alone in the theology I had sworn to uphold. The Church taught that no sin was beyond God's forgiveness if genuine contrition was present. But how could anyone adequately repent for participation in such systematic cruelty? What act of contrition could possibly balance this scale? I took out the small journal I carried in my pocket, the private record of my war experience that supplemented my official reports. In it, I had documented not just what I had witnessed, but my spiritual and emotional responses, my struggles to reconcile faith with the realities of combat and its aftermath. Now, by starlight, I wrote, "Tonight I face my greatest test as a priest. A dying SS guard requests last rites. My every human instinct refuses. My clerical obligation demands. Where in this impossible space is God's will? How can the Church ask me to pronounce God's forgiveness over one who showed none to thousands? Have you ever stood at the crossroads of duty and conscience? Have you been asked to extend forgiveness that felt impossible to give? Have you questioned whether grace itself has limits? Tell me your thoughts below. I need to know if others understand this crucible where faith and humanity collide." After some time, minutes or hours, I couldn't tell, I returned to the dying guard's bedside. He was weaker now, his breathing more labored. The end was clearly approaching. I sat on the small stool beside him, still maintaining a distance that reflected my inner conflict. "What is your name?" I asked, needing somehow to see him as an individual rather than just a uniform, a representation of evil. "Karl Müller," he replied. Then, unexpectedly, I was a seminarian before the war. I almost became a priest like you. The revelation hit me like a physical blow. This man had stood where I had stood, had studied the same theology, had once felt called to the same vocation. What series of choices, compromises, and circumstances had brought him from a seminary to an SS uniform? What weakness or fear or hatred had transformed a potential servant of God into a facilitator of mass murder? Why, I asked, the single word containing all my incomprehension, all my rage, all my desperate need to understand how such evil could exist in God's creation. Karl's eyes fixed on the ceiling. It happened slowly, he said, his German growing weaker. Small compromises, speeches that made sense when we were hungry and humiliated after Versailles, theories that seemed scientific, rational. And then, he paused, fighting for breath. Then, when I realized the truth of what we were doing, I was afraid to object, afraid to be seen as disloyal. Men who questioned disappeared. So I stopped questioning. I told myself I was just following orders. Did you personally kill prisoners? I needed to know, though I wasn't sure why. His eyes met mine. Not directly, not with my hands. I kept records, I supervised work details, I watched selections. Tears leaked from the corners of his eyes. But failure to stop evil is participation in it. This I learned too late. His words echoed my own theological training, the concept of sins of omission, the teaching that we are responsible not just for our actions, but for our inaction in the face of wrong. I had preached this many times. Now it came back to me from the mouth of a dying Nazi. Are you truly repentant? I asked, still searching for a reason to deny him what he asked of me. I do not deserve forgiveness, he whispered, not from men, not from God, not from those who suffered here, but I have nowhere else to turn. In his answer, I heard the essence of grace, not that we deserve it, but that we need it, not that we have earned it, but that it is freely given. The core of my faith, the message I had dedicated my life to sharing, confronted me in the most challenging context imaginable. I opened my prayer book, found the ritual for last rites. My hands still trembled, but for different reasons now. I will hear your confession, I said formally, and I will administer the sacrament, not because you deserve it, but because God's mercy transcends human judgment, even mine. As Karl made his confession, a halting catalogue of failures and complicity, I found myself simultaneously present as a priest and absent as a man. The part of me ordained to serve as God's instrument administered the sacrament according to the ancient ritual. Another part of me raged at the inadequacy of words in the face of such monumental evil. How could the same ritual I used for a dying grandmother in Boston apply here? What did it mean that the Church offered the same grace to victims and perpetrators alike? As I completed the rite, anointing his forehead with oil, Karl gripped my wrist with surprising strength. Tell them, he gasped, the prisoners, I die knowing what we did was unforgivable. Tell them I die acknowledging this truth. I will tell them, I promised, though I wasn't sure if this message would bring comfort or fresh pain to the survivors. He died an hour later. I sat with his body briefly, not in respect but in contemplation of the mystery I had just participated in. Then I returned to my quarters and wrote in my journal far into the night, trying to untangle what had happened, what it meant for my faith, what it revealed about God's expectations of those who serve Him. In the weeks that followed liberation, we worked to restore dignity to the survivors. Medical units fought to save those who could be saved. Army kitchens prepared special meals for bodies that needed to be reintroduced to nutrition gradually. Administrative teams began the overwhelming task of identifying the dead and documenting what had happened at Dachau. I continued my chaplain's duties, conducting memorial services, counseling both survivors and the American soldiers traumatized by what they had witnessed. I never spoke publicly about giving last rites to Karl Müller. It felt too private, too complex to share with others who might see it as a simple case of religious obligation fulfilled. But I did fulfill my promise to him. When survivors asked about justice, about whether God could forgive what had been done to them, I told them about a dying SS guard who acknowledged his guilt. Some found a measure of peace in this, others turned away in anger. Both reactions seemed appropriate to me. The experience altered my priesthood fundamentally. Before Dachau, I had spoken easily of forgiveness, of God's boundless mercy, of grace freely given. Now these concepts had been tested in fire. I still believed in them, but no longer as abstract theological principles. I had seen the cost of forgiveness, not just for the one doing the forgiving, but for the fabric of justice itself. I had felt the weight of pronouncing God's absolution over evil that seemed beyond absolution. When I returned to America in late 1945, I found I could not return to parish ministry. The gentle rhythms of baptisms, weddings, and Sunday sermons felt disconnected from the spiritual realities I had confronted. Instead, I requested assignment to a veterans' hospital where men struggled with physical and psychological wounds from the war. There, my transformed understanding of faith amid atrocity seemed more relevant, more honest. I could sit with their anger, their doubt, their disillusionment, because I had experienced my own. In 1961, the trial of Adolf Eichmann in Jerusalem reopened many of these wounds. News reports detailed his role in organizing the transportation of Jews to death camps, the administrative machinery of genocide. I followed the testimony closely, recognizing in Eichmann's bureaucratic approach to mass murder the same distancing Karl had described. Not directly, not with my hands. The court rejected this defense, establishing that participation in systematic atrocity, even at a remove, constituted full moral culpability. I agreed with this judgment, yet I also remembered Karl's dying words. I have nowhere else to turn. This is the paradox I have lived with for decades, affirming both the necessity of justice and the reality of grace, the unforgivable nature of certain acts, and the existence of forgiveness beyond human understanding. Not a comfortable resolution, but perhaps the only honest one. Throughout the years, my journal from those days has remained my most valued possession. Its pages record not just historical events, but my spiritual journey through darkness. When I reread my entry from that night with Karl, I see a priest confronting the limits of his theology, a man struggling to embody principles that suddenly seemed too costly to uphold. I see someone learning that faith untested by extremity is faith untried. Some survivors of the Holocaust reject the very concept of forgiveness for perpetrators. They argue that some crimes are so enormous that forgiveness trivializes the suffering of victims. I cannot and do not dispute their right to this position. Who am I to prescribe how those who endured such horrors should respond to them? Yet, as a priest, I continued to believe, even through my own crisis of faith, that no human being is beyond the reach of divine mercy, however undeserving they may be by human standards. The most difficult question came from a Dachau survivor I encountered years later at a remembrance event in Washington. After I spoke about the religious significance of bearing witness to atrocity, he approached me privately. "Father," he said, "do you believe God forgave the SS for what they did to us?" I considered carefully before answering. "I believe God's capacity for forgiveness exceeds our human understanding," I said finally. "But I also believe divine forgiveness doesn't eliminate the need for human justice, for accountability, for truth-telling. And it never negates the suffering of victims or their right to their own responses." "Then what is it worth?" he asked, "this divine forgiveness that changes nothing?" His question has echoed through my remaining years of ministry. What indeed is forgiveness worth if it doesn't erase the consequences of evil, doesn't heal all wounds, doesn't restore what was destroyed? I have come to believe that forgiveness, divine or human, isn't about erasing the past, but about creating the possibility of a future not completely defined by that past. It doesn't make the ledger balance. It acknowledges that some debts can never be repaid, yet refuses to let those debts determine everything that follows. I am an old man now. The events at Dachau happened more than half a century ago. The camp where I experienced my greatest spiritual crisis is now a memorial site where visitors come to learn, to remember, to mourn. The generation that perpetrated those horrors and the generation that suffered them are nearly gone. Soon there will be no living witnesses, only testimony, documentation, and memory. What remains is the essential question I confronted at Karl Mueller's deathbed. Is there a limit to grace? My life as a priest has been a long meditation on this question. I've arrived at no definitive answer, only a deepening appreciation for the mystery at Faith Center, that the same God who abhors evil makes forgiveness possible even for the seemingly unforgivable. This is not a comfortable theology. It offers no easy peace, no simple reconciliation. It lives in the tension between justice and mercy, between righteous anger and transcendent love. It acknowledges both the necessity of remembering honestly and the possibility of grace beyond understanding. Perhaps this is the price of genuine peace, not the absence of conflict, but the presence of an uncomfortable truth, that our humanity includes both the capacity for unspeakable evil and the potential for unfathomable forgiveness. In my final years of ministry, when asked what I learned from the war, from Dachau, from that night with a dying SS guard, I share this. True peace exists not in forgetting, but in remembering fully while refusing to be imprisoned by memory. It lives in the space between never forget and life continues. It acknowledges that forgiveness may be the ultimate battlefield, where victory comes at the cost of our righteous anger, not abandoned, but transformed into something that allows both justice and mercy to exist in the same broken world.